When we think of justice for heinous crimes, many of us imagine the gavel pounding, a life sentence, or even capital punishment. But for some of the world's most despicable criminals, the story doesn't end when the prison gates close behind them. Sometimes, justice takes a more brutal and immediate turn, delivered by the hands of fellow inmates. Here's a chilling look at 8 infamous serial killers who met their violent ends behind bars. Number 1. Nikolai Radkovich. Murder in the Frozen Expanse. Let's start with a story that feels like it's ripped from the pages of a dark Russian novel. Nikolai Radkovich was a man who believed he was on a moral crusade. In 1909, he committed the cold-blooded murders of 3 sex workers, claiming he was cleansing the world of what he saw as immoral women. His twisted sense of morality led to his capture, and he was sentenced to 8 years of forced labor in the Siberian wilderness, a fate already considered a living nightmare. However, Radkovich wouldn't survive even half that sentence. 4 years into his grueling labor in Siberia, his fellow inmates turned against him. While the exact details of his death remain murky, what is known is that his violent end was swift and merciless. His death served as a stark reminder of how the prison code often holds no mercy for those who prey on the vulnerable. Number 2. Colin Hatch, A Predator's Final Reckoning. Colin Hatch was a name synonymous with evil in the United Kingdom. Convicted in 1994 for the horrifying murder of a young boy, Hatch's crimes made him one of the most despised prisoners in the British penal system. Authorities placed him in HM Prison Full Sutton, a facility notorious for housing some of the country's most dangerous offenders. But Hatch's sinister chapter came to an abrupt close in February 2011. His killer was Damien Folks, an inmate with a chilling reputation for attacking those who had committed crimes against children. Folks overpowered Hatch in what can only be described as a savage attack, ending the predator's life. For many, there was grim satisfaction in knowing that Hatch faced the kind of brutality he himself inflicted on his innocent victim. Number 3. Robert Liberty. Death awaits even before trial. Robert Liberty was awaiting trial, but his life of crime had already written a damning narrative. He had taken 3 lives, including those of his roommate and a nurse. Yet, his fate was sealed not by the court, but by the hands of a fellow inmate. In the confined quarters of his cell, Liberty was strangled to death by Timothy Dudley. The motive? Dudley, like many inmates, carried a disdain for those who brought harm to innocent people. The justice Liberty faced was sudden and unrelenting, leaving no room for appeals or defenses. His death echoed the brutal and unpredictable nature of life in prison. Number 4. Leslie Bailey. Betrayed, even in protective custody. Some crimes are so horrifying that even the most hardened criminals can't stomach them. Leslie Bailey was one such individual. A Rule 43 inmate at Whitemore Prison, Bailey required segregation due to the nature of his crimes. He was linked to the deaths of at least 3 individuals, and his reputation made him a marked man. Despite being placed under special protection, prison guards discovered Bailey strangled in his cell in October 1993. His killers were never officially identified, but many speculated it was an act of vigilante justice carried out by inmates who saw Bailey as an abomination. His death became another example of how even the strongest measures of protection can falter in the face of overwhelming hatred. Number 5. Donald Leroy Evans, a killer among killers. Donald Leroy Evans, self-proclaimed murderer of over 70 people, was a name that struck fear even among his fellow inmates. Though officially convicted of only 2 murders, Evans bragged about his heinous acts, cementing his legacy as a pathological liar and a monster. In 1999, his reign of terror ended not with the electric chair, but with a blade in the hands of fellow inmate Jimmy Mack. The confrontation occurred in the showers, a space where prison violence often erupts. Mack, driven by personal motives or perhaps disgust at Evans's audacious claims, delivered the fatal blow. Evans's death was both a relief to many and a reminder of how even the vilest criminals are not invincible. 6. James Whitey, Bulger, the mob boss beaten to death. James Whitey Bulger was a figure of infamy in Boston's underworld. As a mob boss and FBI informant, his life was a mix of betrayal, power, and violence. After spending 17 years as a fugitive, Bulger was finally captured in 2011 and sentenced to life behind bars. But even for a man as feared as Bulger, the prison system held dangers he couldn't escape. Transferred to USP Hazleton in West Virginia in October 2018, Bulger lasted less than 24 hours. His fellow inmates beat the 89-year-old to death, targeting him as a former informant and criminal mastermind. The violent act brought an end to a life steeped in treachery, leaving his legacy forever marred by betrayal and brutality. Number 7. Donald Harvey, the Angel of Death meets Retribution. Donald Harvey's moniker, the Angel of Death, belied his gruesome actions. Responsible for the deaths of over 80 hospital patients, Harvey claimed he was ending their suffering. His twisted justification didn't sit well with the public or his fellow inmates. On March 30, 2017, Harvey faced the ultimate reckoning at Toledo Correctional Institution. James Elliott, an inmate with a personal vendetta, beat him to death in a savage attack. Elliott later claimed he had relatives among Harvey's victims, adding a deeply personal layer to the act. For many, Harvey's death felt like poetic justice, a fitting end for a man who took so many lives under the guise of mercy. Number 8. Leopold Dion, a predator falls to madness. Leopold Dion was a Canadian serial killer whose crimes were beyond comprehension. He murdered 4 young boys and raped 21 others, his reign of terror leaving an indelible scar on the nation. Released from prison once, Dion's freedom led to even more atrocities. But in 1972, his time finally ran out. Normand Champagne, an inmate known as Lawrence of Arabia, stabbed Dion to death. Champagne's mental state was called into question, and he was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity. For the families of Dion's victims, his death brought a semblance of closure to an otherwise horrific tale. These stories are stark reminders of the raw and brutal justice that sometimes plays out behind prison walls. For these killers, their violent ends were the final chapters in lives defined by unimaginable darkness. While their crimes are unforgettable, so too are the dramatic and often ironic circumstances of their deaths. When serial killers meet violent ends in prison, the public reaction, the feelings of victims' families, and the internal dynamics of the prison system reveal a complex tapestry of emotions and responses. The aftermath of these events offers insights into justice, vengeance, and human morality, all wrapped in a brutal reality. Let's delve into these perspectives in detail. The public's reaction to serial killers being murdered in prison is often visceral and unfiltered. These reactions range from relief to outright celebration, with many seeing these deaths as a form of poetic justice. Social media, online forums, and news comment sections become digital arenas where individuals vent their feelings about the killer's fates. For instance, when serial killer Billy Shamir was murdered in prison, the media noted the overwhelming public reaction. Viewers flooded comment sections with messages so graphic and intense that news networks reportedly deemed them not appropriate to air on television. It wasn't just anger, it was a collective exhale, a moment when society felt justice had been served, albeit through unconventional means. Public perception often hinges on the heinous nature of the killer's crimes. People are naturally repulsed by acts of extreme violence, particularly those targeting children or vulnerable individuals. When such criminals meet violent ends, it triggers a primal sense of satisfaction. The sentiment, though rarely spoken aloud, is clear. They got what they deserved. At the same time, some caution against glorifying these deaths. Critics argue that celebrating such violence risks dehumanizing society itself. Yet, the visceral reactions continue to pour in, reflecting deep-seated anger and a collective need for catharsis. The families of the victims find themselves grappling with a whirlwind of emotions when they hear about the deaths of the killers who shattered their lives. For some, these deaths are a long-awaited moment of closure. A mother of one victim, reflecting on the death of her child's killer, described the feeling as, like a horrible stink had just drifted out the window, and suddenly, I could breathe fresh air again. This sentiment captures the relief many feel, knowing that the person responsible for their suffering is no longer alive. However, closure is not universal. Some families feel these deaths come far too late. 35 years too late, one father lamented after hearing of a serial killer's demise. For him and many others, the years of anguish, grief, and legal battles could never be erased by a single moment of retribution. The death of the killer may mark the end of their story, but it doesn't erase the trauma experienced by those left behind. On the flip side, a few families express frustration that these killers avoided formal justice. They believe that a life sentence served in isolation would have been a more fitting punishment, forcing the murderer to reflect on their crimes every single day. The sudden death of the killer, in their view, robbed them of the opportunity to see justice carried out in full. Prisons are more than just buildings with bars and locks. They are microcosms of society with their own unique rules and hierarchies. In this brutal environment, even among the most hardened criminals, certain lines cannot be crossed. Serial killers, particularly those who prey on children or vulnerable individuals, are often at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The unwritten code of prison life dictates that these individuals are prime targets for retribution. For instance, Leslie Bailey, a notorious child killer, was housed under Rule 43, segregation designed to protect vulnerable inmates. Despite these precautions, Bailey was murdered in his cell, proving that even the most robust safety measures can be circumvented by determined inmates. Prison officials constantly grapple with this reality. They must decide whether to place high-profile offenders in protective custody or let them navigate the general population. Inmates, however, often find creative ways to bypass security. For example, makeshift weapons, secret alliances, and carefully coordinated attacks have led to the deaths of many infamous prisoners. The reasons behind these attacks vary. Some inmates feel a moral obligation to correct the perceived failures of the justice system. Others simply seek notoriety, knowing that killing a high-profile inmate will elevate their status within the prison. Whatever the motivation, the result is the same: brutal and often premeditated violence. Law enforcement officials, psychologists, and criminologists have long studied the phenomenon of inmate-on-inmate violence. Their analyses suggest that these killings represent a form of informal justice, where prisoners enforce their own moral code. Serial killers, especially those who harm the innocent, are seen as ultimate betrayers of societal norms and therefore become prime targets. One study noted that the psychological profiles of inmates who kill serial killers often reveal a deep sense of moral outrage. These individuals may have experienced similar trauma in their own lives or harbor personal connections to the victims of such crimes. This dynamic creates a volatile environment where certain prisoners take it upon themselves to act as judge, jury, and executioner. Prison administrators are acutely aware of this reality. Despite placing notorious criminals in isolation, there are countless examples of these individuals being attacked or killed. Jeffrey Dahmer's death is a prime example. The infamous serial killer, responsible for the deaths and mutilations of 17 young men, was beaten to death by a fellow inmate in 1994. Dahmer's killer later stated that he felt God told me to do it, further illustrating the deep-seated moral and emotional drivers behind these acts. The deaths of serial killers in prison reignite an age-old debate about justice and morality. Are these killings a form of poetic justice, or do they reflect the darker aspects of human nature? For many, the visceral satisfaction of seeing a killer meet a violent end feels right. It satisfies the primal urge for vengeance, a feeling deeply ingrained in human psychology. However, others argue that such responses risk eroding the very fabric of justice. Celebrating violence, even against the most heinous individuals, may normalize brutality in ways that have broader societal implications. Critics caution that justice should be about rehabilitation and accountability, not revenge. The murders of serial killers in prison offer a glimpse into the complexities of justice, vengeance, and morality. The public response often reflects deep anger and a desire for retribution, while the families of victims navigate a labyrinth of emotions. Within prisons, the unwritten codes of justice ensure that no crime goes unpunished, even if it means circumventing official channels. Meanwhile, professionals and society at large grapple with the broader implications of these events. These stories, while chilling, force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own notions of justice and humanity. They remind us that even in the darkest corners of society where serial killers reside, the desire for accountability burns bright. Law enforcement officials, psychologists, and criminologists have long studied the phenomenon of inmate-on-inmate violence. Their analyses suggest that these killings represent a form of informal justice, where prisoners enforce their own moral code. Serial killers, especially those who harm the innocent, are seen as ultimate betrayers of societal norms, and therefore become prime targets. The deaths of serial killers in prison reignite an age-old debate about justice and morality. Are these killings a form of poetic justice, or do they reflect the darker aspects of human nature? For many, the visceral satisfaction of seeing a killer meet a violent end feels right. It satisfies the primal urge for vengeance, a feeling deeply ingrained in human psychology. However, others argue that such responses risk eroding the very fabric of justice. Celebrating violence, even against the most heinous individuals, may normalize brutality in ways that have broader societal implications. Critics caution that justice should be about rehabilitation and accountability, not revenge.